Good evening, dear listener. Midnight Cat is here beside you once again, padding softly through the quiet rooms of history. Settle deeper beneath your blankets, let the day drift away, and listen to the gentle hush of an ancient sea. Tonight, we will follow a story carried for more than 2,000 years. A story of bright temples, distant islands, proud rulers, and waves that seemed to swallow an entire world. Somewhere beyond the known shores, the old tale says, there once stood a city more splendid than any other. Its harbours were crowded with ships, its walls shone with metal. Water flowed through rings of land and stone, and gardens spread beneath a warm western sun. Then, in a single terrible passage of time, the island vanished beneath the sea. But where did this story begin? Was Atlantis a memory of a real disaster, reshaped across generations? Was it a philosopher's carefully made fable, or did the sea preserve some fragment of truth beneath its restless surface? To seek the answer, we must first travel not to Atlantis itself, but to Athens in the 4th century before the Common Era. The city was quieter in the early morning, before the public squares filled with merchants and citizens. Before arguments rose beneath the colonnades, the pale light touched the slopes of the Acropolis and caught upon the marble temples above. Donkeys moved through narrow streets. Potters opened their workshops. Smoke drifted from household hearths, carrying the scent of olive wood and warm bread. Among the city's philosophers was Plato, a man already well known for writing conversations in which questions unfolded slowly, like doors opening into deeper rooms. He had been born into an aristocratic Athenian family and had lived through years of war, political turmoil, and disappointment. His teacher, Socrates, had been condemned to death by the city. Plato had watched governments rise, fail, and replace one another. He had seen that power, when separated from wisdom and restraint, could become dangerous. In 2 of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the unfinished Critias, Plato introduced the island of Atlantis. He did not describe it as a rumor recently heard in a harbor tavern. Instead, he placed the tale within a chain of remembrance. Critias, one of the speakers, says that the story had been told to him in childhood by an older relative, who had received it through the family of Solon, the celebrated Athenian lawgiver. Solon, in turn, was said to have learned it from Egyptian priests during a journey to the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. It was a long path for a story to travel, from Egyptian priests to a Greek visitor, from Solon to his relatives, and from an old man to a child who would later repeat it among philosophers. Plato's listeners would have known that such a chain was difficult to prove, yet Egypt carried a special weight in the Greek imagination. Its temples seemed unimaginably ancient. Its priests preserved records, rituals, and traditions older than many Greek cities. To say that a tale came from Egypt was to wrap it in the atmosphere of deep time. In Plato's account, the priests gently challenged the Greeks' understanding of their own past. They told Solon that humanity had endured many destructions, some by fire, others by water, and that survivors often lost the memory of what had come before. Mountain people might escape a flood, but written records, cities, and institutions could disappear. History, therefore, was not a straight road. It was a shoreline repeatedly washed clean. The thought would have felt both strange and familiar. Greek communities lived close to the sea and beneath uncertain skies. Earthquakes shook the Aegean. Coastal settlements could be damaged by sudden waves. Volcanoes, though poorly understood, could darken the heavens. Sailors returned with stories of islands altered by storms and harbours ruined in a single season. According to the Egyptian priests in Plato's story, Atlantis had existed 9,000 years before Solon's visit. It lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the name commonly associated with the narrow gateway now called the Strait of Gibraltar. To Mediterranean sailors, those pillars marked the edge of the familiar sea. Beyond them stretched the Atlantic Ocean, broad, deep, and mysterious. The island, Plato wrote, was larger than Libya and Asia combined, though those geographical terms referred to regions known to the Greeks rather than the modern continents. From Atlantis, travelers could supposedly reach other islands, and beyond them a great encircling land. At the heart of the island stood a remarkable capital. Its beginnings were described through myth. Poseidon, god of the sea, loved a mortal woman named Cleito, who lived upon a low hill. To protect her, he enclosed the hill within alternating rings of water and land. Their descendants became rulers, and the eldest, Atlas, gave his name to the island and the surrounding ocean. To Plato's audience, this was not presented as ordinary civic history. Gods often stood at the beginnings of cities and royal families in Greek tradition. Such origins expressed identity and sacred order. Yet, beneath the mythic surface, Plato described the city with an almost architectural patience. There were concentric circles, 3 rings of water and 2 of land surrounding the central island. Bridges crossed the channels. A great canal connected the outer ring to the sea. Ships passed inward toward protected docks, and the sound of sailors, merchants, and craftsmen filled the harbour spaces. Imagine for a moment approaching from the ocean at dusk. The wind softens as the ship enters the canal. Oars dip into darkening water. Stone walls rise on either side, and lamps begin to glow along the quays. The air carries salt, damp rope, cedar resin, fish, smoke, and unfamiliar spices from distant ports. Above the harbour, buildings stand upon the circular islands, their facades faced with white, black, and red stone quarried from beneath the city. At the centre rises a temple dedicated to Poseidon and Cleito. Plato says that portions of the sanctuary were adorned with gold, silver, ivory, and a mysterious reddish metal called orichalcum. Ancient readers did not necessarily know exactly what this substance was. It may have referred to a valued copper alloy or to a legendary metal whose brilliance served the richness of the tale. In the story, it gleamed along walls and pillars second only to gold in value. Fresh water flowed from springs, one warm and one cold. Baths were built for rulers, private citizens, women, and horses. Gardens were watered, reservoirs supplied the population. Outside the central city lay a broad and fertile plain, crossed by canals and sheltered by mountains. It was a place of abundance, but also of careful organization. Fields produced grain, orchards bore fruit, animals grazed in open country. Forests supplied timber for ships and buildings. Elephants, Plato says, lived upon the island, a detail that made Atlantis seem both distant and vast. Yet the city's beauty was not the true center of Plato's story. Atlantis was powerful. Its kings governed territories across the island and held influence over other lands. They were bound by laws said to have come from Poseidon, and they met in solemn ceremony to judge disputes and renew their obligations. For generations, Plato tells us, they remained moderate. Though wealthy, they valued virtue above possessions. They understood that prosperity could vanish and that harmony mattered more than splendor. But slowly, something changed. The divine portion of their nature, as the dialogue expresses it, became weakened by repeated mixture with mortality. The Atlanteans grew ambitious. Their wealth no longer satisfied them. Their power turned outward, and beyond the pillars of Heracles, ships began to gather upon the western sea. The islands and coast within the Mediterranean had long known the arrival of foreign sails. Traders came bearing tin, ivory, dyed cloth, oil, grain, carved wood, and stories from lands beyond the horizon. Fleets could mean exchange, but they could also mean tribute, conquest, and fear. In Plato's telling, the rulers of Atlantis sought dominion over all the lands within the pillars, pressing eastward from their ocean kingdom toward Libya, Egypt, Italy, and the Greek world. Against them stood an ancient Athens, unlike the city Plato knew. This earlier Athens was described as disciplined, orderly, and unusually virtuous. Its citizens lived without excessive luxury. Its warriors defended their homeland not for personal wealth, but for the common good. Other peoples fell away or submitted, yet the Athenians remained. Alone, they resisted the Atlantean advance and finally defeated it, freeing the threatened lands. The victory, however, did not bring a long season of peace. Afterward came earthquakes and floods of extraordinary violence. In one dreadful day and night, Plato says, the warriors of ancient Athens were swallowed by the earth, while Atlantis sank beneath the sea. The ocean beyond the pillars became impassable, clogged by shoals of mud left by the vanished island. And there, almost at the moment when a reader might expect further explanation, the account begins to recede. The Timaeus moves on to larger questions about the universe, nature, and the human soul. The Critias returns to Atlantis and describes its landscape, government, wealth, and decline in greater detail. But the surviving text breaks off before Zeus announces the judgment he intends to place upon the island. The sentence ends, and with it the ancient narrative falls silent. Perhaps Plato never completed the dialogue. Perhaps the missing portion was lost in antiquity. No surviving evidence settles the question. Yet the unfinished ending gave Atlantis a strange advantage over more complete tales. It left an open door. For centuries, readers could step through it. Before following them, it is worth pausing in Plato's Athens and asking what his first audience may have heard beneath the story's shining surfaces. They knew philosophical dialogues were not simple chronicles. Plato often created settings, speeches, and myths to examine justice, power, education, and the design of an ideal state. Atlantis, magnificent and morally decaying, could be understood as a mirror held before societies that confused prosperity with goodness. The ancient Athens of the tale was not a precise reconstruction of the distant past. It resembled the disciplined civic ideal Plato admired. Atlantis, meanwhile, possessed wealth, naval strength, engineering, empire, and appetite without restraint. Its fall completed a moral pattern familiar in Greek thought. Abundance encouraged pride, pride weakened judgment, and unchecked ambition invited ruin. This does not prove that every detail was invented without inspiration. Stories often grow from many soils at once. A philosopher may shape a fable from memories of real disasters, old travel traditions, political anxieties, and familiar myths. But the purpose of a tale is not always the same as the origin of each image within it. Plato's description would have awakened echoes in Greek listeners. They knew of cities broken by earthquakes. They knew that coastlines could change. The city of Helike, on the southern shore of the Gulf of Corinth, had been destroyed by an earthquake and sea flooding in 373, before the Common Era during Plato's lifetime. Ancient accounts said that the city disappeared beneath the water, and for generations fishermen were said to have caught their nets upon submerged ruins. There were also memories of older catastrophes in the Aegean. Long before Plato, during the Bronze Age, the volcanic island now called Santorini had suffered an immense eruption. Its ancient name was Thera. At the settlement of Akrotiri, buildings were buried beneath ash, preserving rooms, vessels, stairways, storage jars, and vivid wall paintings. The eruption damaged communities across the region and sent waves through the surrounding sea. Plato did not mention Thera, and no surviving source connects his Atlantis directly with that eruption. The dates, locations, and dimensions do not match his account. Atlantis lay beyond the pillars of Heracles, while Thera stood within the Aegean. Plato placed the catastrophe thousands of years earlier than the Bronze Age eruption. Yet the resemblance of certain images has invited comparison. A prosperous maritime culture, elaborate architecture, volcanic destruction, and a landscape altered by the sea. To understand why this comparison became so compelling, imagine the Aegean many centuries before Plato's birth. Morning light lies upon the water like pale bronze. A merchant vessel moves between islands, its square sail taking the north wind. On board are jars of oil and wine, bundles of cloth, tools, carved cups, and perhaps tablets recording quantities owed and delivered. The sailors navigate by headlands, stars, currents, and memory. Islands rise from the sea one after another, some dry and rocky, others green with terraces and vineyards. Thera would have appeared as a ring of land surrounding a broad volcanic bay. On its southern shore stood Akrotiri, a town of narrow streets and multi-storied houses. Some walls carried paintings of lilies, monkeys, ships, fishermen, and young people gathering saffron. Clay pipes and channels managed water and waste. Storage rooms held grain and pottery. The town participated in the wide commercial world of the Bronze Age Aegean. Its people were not Atlanteans. Archaeologists usually connect Akrotiri with the Cycladic world and with strong Minoan influence from Crete. The Minoan civilization, centered on that larger island to the south, built palatial complexes, maintained maritime networks, and produced art of remarkable grace and movement. At Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, courtyards opened between painted halls, workshops, storerooms, staircases, and shrines. Bronze tools rang beneath craftsmen's hands. Scribes pressed signs into clay tablets. Traders arrived from Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean. Olive oil, wine, timber, textiles, metals, and fine pottery moved along sea routes that had been sailed for generations. The sea was not an empty border, it was a road. Yet beneath Thera, pressure had been gathering in the earth. Small tremors may have come first. Walls cracked, roof tiles shifted, animals grew uneasy. At Akrotiri, there is evidence that inhabitants had time to leave before the final burial by ash. For very few human remains have been found there. They may have carried portable wealth and sailed away, expecting perhaps to return when the danger passed. Then the eruption entered its great phases. Ash rose into the sky. Pumice fell upon roofs and courtyards. Daylight faded beneath a vast cloud. The sound may have travelled across the sea. Parts of the island collapsed into the emptied volcanic chamber, enlarging the caldera. Waves struck nearby coasts, though scholars continued to study their precise scale and effects. On Crete, the consequences were serious but complex. The eruption did not instantly erase Minoan civilization. Many settlements continued and the great palaces were rebuilt or remained active. Yet ash damaged ports, disrupted trade, and later political upheavals may all have contributed to changes that unfolded across generations. Centuries passed. The exact memory of the eruption, if preserved in oral tradition, would have altered as languages, peoples, and kingdoms changed. The event may have vanished from Greek remembrance entirely, or fragments may have survived in forms too transformed to identify with certainty. Far from the buried rooms of Akrotiri, the sea continued to polish black stones along the broken rim of Thera. While beneath the ash, painted ships waited in darkness for more than 3,000 years. When those rooms returned to human sight, the discovery seemed almost dreamlike. In the late 19th century, the island of Santorini had already begun to reveal traces of its buried past. Quarry workers cutting into the volcanic deposits sometimes uncovered walls and pottery beneath the layers of pumice. Yet systematic excavation came later, and in 1967 the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos began work at Akrotiri with a bold idea in mind. He believed the eruption of Thera might have helped weaken the Minoan world on Crete, and he hoped the buried town would preserve evidence of the catastrophe. The earth yielded more than anyone expected. Under the ash stood houses with walls still rising several stories high. Doorways opened into rooms where storage jars remained in place. Stone staircases climbed toward floors that had vanished. Wooden beams had decayed, leaving empty impressions that archaeologists could fill and study. In some buildings, painted plaster still clung to the walls, bright with mineral colors protected by darkness. There were swallows flying among red lilies. Blue monkeys climbed across a rocky landscape. A fisherman carried silver strings of fish in both hands. Young women gathered saffron flowers. Most famous of all, a long painted procession of ships moved between coastal settlements, their hulls decorated, their crews seated beneath awnings, their destination alive with people, animals, and architecture. To modern eyes, the fleet seemed to glide out of the Bronze Age. It was easy to look at Akrotiri's streets, water channels, painted chambers, and maritime art and think of Plato's splendid island. Newspapers, popular books, and documentaries began to present Thera as a possible Atlantis. The broken ring of Santorini itself appeared suggestive, land surrounding a central sea shaped by volcanic destruction. Yet archaeology requires patience with differences as well as delight in similarities. Akrotiri was a prosperous town, but it was not a continent-sized empire. Its eruption occurred roughly 12 centuries before Plato, not 9,000 years before Solon. It stood east of mainland Greece, not beyond Gibraltar. There is no evidence that its people launched the vast campaign Plato described, nor that the town was destroyed as punishment for moral decline. Even the circular plan of Atlantis does not closely match the settlement uncovered beneath the ash. Plato's rings were engineered around a central hill in a carefully ordered capital. Santorini's caldera was formed by natural volcanic processes, and Akrotiri lay near its southern shore, rather than at the center of concentric harbors. Still, the comparison remains valuable when treated as possibility rather than proof. Thera demonstrates that wealthy island communities could suffer overwhelming destruction. It shows that the ancient Mediterranean contained disasters dramatic enough to become legend. It also reveals how easily the modern imagination joins a known ruin to an unfinished tale. But Santorini is only one of many places that have been invited into the mystery. Some seekers have turned west, following Plato's words beyond the pillars of Heracles. At the narrow strait between southern Iberia and northern Africa, the Mediterranean opens into the Atlantic. To ancient sailors, the crossing could feel like a threshold. Currents moved strongly through it. Winds could change without warning. The familiar coastline gave way to a broader ocean, and the routes ahead demanded knowledge of tides unlike those within the inland sea. Beyond the strait lay the coasts of what are now Spain, Portugal, and Morocco. Farther out stood island groups that later explorers would know as Madeira, the Canaries, and the Azores. Each has, at one time or another, been proposed as a remnant, neighbor, or memory of Atlantis. The Azores, scattered across the North Atlantic, have attracted particular attention because they rise from a volcanic region and stand amid deep water. Their green slopes, crater lakes, mist, and black rock can look like fragments of a drowned landscape. Yet geological study shows that the islands are volcanic peaks formed over immense spans of time. There is no accepted evidence that a large inhabited continent sank there within the period of human civilization. Continents do not ordinarily vanish into the ocean in a single day. Their crust is too thick and buoyant. Islands can collapse, coastlines can drown, and volcanic eruptions can remove or reshape great areas. But the complete sinking of a landmass larger than ancient Libya and Asia combined belongs more naturally to myth than geology. Closer to Gibraltar, researchers have studied submerged landscapes and ancient shorelines. During the last ice age, sea levels were much lower than they are today. Coastal plains now beneath water were once dry land. As glaciers melted, the oceans rose gradually, covering bays, river valleys, and settlements. For communities living through generations of shoreline change, the sea may indeed have seemed to consume parts of the world. Off southern Spain, attention has often turned toward the marshlands near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River. In antiquity, this region bordered the territory associated with Tartessos, a wealthy culture known to Greek and Phoenician writers. Tartessos flourished through trade in silver, copper, tin, and other goods. Its exact political nature remains debated, and many of its settlements were shaped by contact between local communities and Phoenician merchants. Because Tartessos lay in the far west and possessed mineral wealth, some have linked it with Atlantis. A few surveys have identified circular or rectangular features beneath marshy ground, encouraging claims of buried cities. Yet natural formations, later settlements, and agricultural patterns can easily resemble human structures when viewed from above. No discovery there has gained broad archaeological acceptance as Plato's lost capital. Tartessos itself is real, and that is perhaps more interesting than forcing it into another story. Imagine a settlement near the Great River in the early first millennium before the Common Era. Flat-bottomed boats move through channels bordered by reeds. Beyond the wetlands, herds graze and miners work the mineral-rich hills. Phoenician vessels arrive from colonies along the southern coast, carrying fine pottery, glass, ornaments, cedar products, and Eastern customs. Local metals pass outward toward the Mediterranean. At evening, smoke rises from low buildings. Waterbirds settle in the shallows. Traders speak through interpreters, weighing silver on small balances. News travels with them. Rumors of distant kings, strange animals, storms beyond the strait, and islands seen beneath western clouds. A Greek sailor hearing such accounts might imagine the Atlantic margins as a realm of extraordinary wealth. Generations later, a philosopher could place a powerful island kingdom there and know that his audience would feel the distance. Across the water, the coast of Morocco offered other possibilities. Archaeologists have examined ancient settlements, unusual rock formations, and the wide plains near the Atlantic. One natural feature much farther south in Mauritania has gained modern fame through images taken from the air. The Richat structure, a vast pattern of concentric rings in the Sahara. From high above, it resembles an enormous target pressed into the desert. Some enthusiasts have claimed that these rings match Plato's capital, but the Richat structure is a geological formation deeply eroded over millions of years. It is far larger than Plato's city, lies well inland today, and has not produced evidence of the Bronze Age maritime civilization required by the theory. The resemblance is visual, and visual resemblances are powerful. The human mind is skilled at finding familiar forms in clouds, hills, coastlines, and stone. Once the rings of Atlantis are expected, circles everywhere begin to look like clues. Meanwhile, the true ancient landscapes of the Atlantic coast remain quieter and more complicated. They contain shell middens, stone tools, burial places, pottery fragments, trading posts, and harbors altered by silt. Their stories belong to real communities who lived beside shifting waters and watched the sun descend into an ocean that seemed to have no end. And as darkness spread across that western horizon, the question of Atlantis drifted onward, leaving the shores of antiquity and entering the libraries of later ages. In the centuries after Plato's death, His works continued to be copied, discussed, criticized, and taught across the Greek-speaking world. Readers encountered Atlantis not as an isolated legend, but within dialogues concerned with politics, nature, order, and the fate of societies. Some accepted that Plato was describing a real place. Others treated the island as a philosophical invention. Even in antiquity, there was no single agreed interpretation. Aristotle, who had studied in Plato's academy, is sometimes said to have dismissed Atlantis with the remark that the man who created it also destroyed it. The wording survives only through much later testimony, so it cannot be treated as certain. Yet the idea suits one ancient line of thought. Atlantis existed because Plato needed it, and it sank because his argument required an ending. Other writers were less skeptical. Crantor, an early commentator on Plato, was later reported to have believed the story true and to have sought confirmation in Egypt. According to the account, Egyptian records supported what Plato had written. But those records have not survived, and the report itself comes through authors writing long afterward. It shows that the desire to verify Atlantis began early, even if the evidence remained beyond reach. For Roman readers, the tale belonged to a larger inheritance of Greek learning. Geographers measured the known world. Natural philosophers discussed earthquakes, tides, and changes in the land. Sailors ventured through the Strait of Gibraltar and along the Atlantic coasts, yet no expedition returned with a ruined island kingdom matching Plato's description. The sea beyond the pillars remained immense, but it was no longer empty. Phoenician and Carthaginian mariners had long sailed the western waters. They visited Iberia and northwestern Africa, and some voyages may have gone much farther. The Carthaginian explorer Hanno left an account preserved in Greek of a journey down the African coast. Another tradition told of Himilco sailing northward toward the Atlantic lands of Tin. Their routes were difficult and dangerous, but they revealed coasts, islands, currents, and peoples, not the surviving towers of Atlantis. As knowledge expanded, the lost island did not disappear. Instead, it moved into a different kind of distance. After the Western Roman Empire faded, Plato's complete works became less widely available in Latin Europe. The name Atlantis survived in fragments, commentaries, geographical traditions, and learned memory, but it did not dominate medieval imagination. Other vanished realms filled that space: islands of saints, earthly paradises, kingdoms hidden beyond mist, and lands believed to lie at the margins of maps. Medieval maps were not simply navigational charts. Many were arrangements of history, theology, geography, and wonder. Jerusalem might stand at the center. The east could be placed at the top toward the direction of Eden and sunrise. Oceans encircled the inhabited world, while distant regions held strange beasts, legendary peoples, and places inherited from ancient texts. On some maps, islands appeared not because a cartographer had seen them, but because a traveler had heard of them, a monk had copied them, or an older authority had once placed them there. Names drifted from manuscript to manuscript. Coastlines changed shape. A single uncertain report could become a permanent patch of land. In monasteries and scriptoria, winter evenings were lit by small flames. A scribe bent over parchment, his breath faint in the cold room. Outside, rain tapped upon stone, and beyond the walls the roads were dark. Inside, the ancient world survived line by careful line. A place could remain alive in this way without being found. Atlantis, when mentioned, still belonged primarily to Plato. It had not yet become the universal lost civilization of modern imagination. That transformation required two things: the recovery of classical learning in Western Europe and the opening of the Atlantic to voyages that changed the scale of the known world. During the Renaissance, scholars sought Greek manuscripts, produced new translations, and read Plato with renewed attention. The invention of printing allowed text to circulate more widely. Philosophers, mapmakers, merchants, and rulers began to encounter ancient ideas within a world becoming larger before their eyes. Then ships crossed the ocean. The voyages of the late 15th and early 16th centuries connected Europe more directly with lands across the Atlantic. To Europeans, these territories seemed new, though they were home to ancient and complex societies with histories of their own. The discovery forced scholars to reconsider old geographical assumptions. How did these continents fit into the writings of classical authors? Had the ancients known of them? Could they be remnants of lands mentioned in legend? Atlantis was drawn into those questions. Some writers proposed that the Americas were the great land beyond Plato's island. Others suggested that Atlantis had once served as a bridge between the old world and the new, allowing peoples, animals, or ideas to pass across the ocean before the island sank. These theories attempted to explain similarities between distant cultures, but they rested upon assumptions rather than evidence. They also often ignored the independent achievements and long development of indigenous civilizations. Still, the attraction was powerful. Atlantis seemed to offer a hidden road through history. In 1627, Francis Bacon's unfinished work, New Atlantis, was published. Bacon was not claiming to reveal Plato's island. He borrowed the name for a philosophical tale about an ideal society devoted to learning, observation, and useful knowledge. His island of Bensalem stood in the Pacific, not the Atlantic, and its purpose was to imagine what an organized community of inquiry might accomplish. The title showed how flexible Atlantis had become. It no longer referred only to a destroyed empire. It could suggest a perfect society, a distant laboratory, or a place where human knowledge had taken another path. Other authors used the legend to discuss vanished ages, the origins of nations, and the shape of the earth before known history. Some placed Atlantis near the Americas. Some identified it with islands in the Atlantic. Others stretched the story until it became a key capable of opening every unexplained door. Meanwhile, cartographers continued their careful work. Picture a workshop in a European port during the Age of Sail. Sheets of paper lie beneath weighted corners. Compasses, rulers, dividers, and ink pots crowd a wooden table. Through an open window comes the smell of tar, salt, and rain. A map maker studies reports brought home by captains, the direction of a coast, the depth of a harbour, the position of an island under a certain star. Verified shorelines are drawn more firmly. Uncertain islands receive faint outlines. Empty spaces invite both caution and imagination. Sailors occasionally reported land that later could not be found. Clouds near the horizon might resemble mountains. Floating ice, banks of fog, mirages, or errors in longitude could create convincing illusions. Such phantom islands appeared on charts for years, sometimes centuries, before repeated voyages erased them. Among these uncertain places were Antilia, the Isle of Seven Cities, and other lands said to lie west of Europe. Some were connected with stories of refugees who had fled across the sea. Others may have grown from distorted reports of real islands. Their presence created a maritime world where geography and legend touched at the edges. Atlantis did not need to appear on every map. It existed behind the maps as a possibility that the ocean still concealed something enormous. By the 18th century, however, navigation, surveying, and natural science had begun to change the nature of the search. Expeditions measured coastlines more precisely. Instruments improved. The Atlantic became a space of routes, winds, depths, and currents rather than a blank blue field. Yet the mystery did not diminish. It merely descended from the horizon to the ocean floor. For most of human history, the deep ocean had been less a landscape than an idea. A sailor could read the surface by colour, wind, swell, birds, and floating weed. A lead line lowered over the side might reveal a shallow bank or the approach to land. But far from shore, where the rope descended and still found no bottom, the sea seemed without measure. Whatever lay beneath was hidden by cold, pressure, and darkness. During the 19th century, that darkness began to receive numbers. Naval vessels and survey ships crossed the Atlantic, taking soundings along proposed routes for submarine telegraph cables. Weighted lines were lowered mile after mile. Samples of mud and tiny marine shells came back from the depths. The ocean floor, once imagined as a smooth and perhaps bottomless basin, revealed ridges, plains, slopes, and trenches. One great feature ran through the Atlantic like the seam of an immense garment. Today it is known as the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, part of a vast underwater mountain system formed where tectonic plates move slowly apart. In the 19th century, its nature was not yet understood, but its discovery encouraged speculation. If mountains rose beneath the ocean, perhaps some had once stood above it. Perhaps drowned plateaus or broken islands could explain the old story. The temptation was understandable. Imagine a chart spread beneath lamplight, marked with the depths gathered from hundreds of soundings. A broad ridge rises from the surrounding abyss. Volcanic islands, the Azores, Iceland, Ascension, Tristan da Cunha appear above the water along related zones of activity. To a reader already searching for Atlantis, the pattern might resemble the spine of a lost country. Yet, an underwater mountain range is not the same as a sunken continent. Modern geology would eventually show that oceanic crust forms and changes through processes very different from the sudden collapse Plato described. The ridge had not supported a great landmass that vanished within human memory. It was and remains a place where new seafloor is created over geological time. Before that understanding became widely established, however, Atlantis entered a new and far more expansive phase. In 1882, the American writer and politician Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. His book gathered myths, architectural comparisons, linguistic guesses, ancient traditions, and geological ideas into a sweeping argument. Donnelly proposed that Atlantis had been a real island in the Atlantic and the common source of many early civilizations. Egypt, Mesoamerica, the Mediterranean world, and other cultures, he believed, had inherited knowledge from Atlantean survivors. The book became enormously influential. Donnelly wrote during an age fascinated by progress, empire, archaeology, and the possibility that newly discovered ruins might overturn accepted history. Great ancient cities were emerging from sand and soil. Cuneiform tablets were being deciphered. Scholars were reconstructing forgotten kingdoms in Mesopotamia. Heinrich Schliemann's excavations at Helike had renewed public belief that places long associated with epic poetry might have archaeological foundations. In such a climate, Atlantis no longer seemed merely poetic, it seemed discoverable. Donnelly's method, however, often treated resemblance as proof. Pyramids found in different parts of the world were assumed to require a shared origin. Flood traditions were woven together as memories of a single event. Similar symbols, tools, or customs were linked without sufficient attention to independent invention, chronology, geography, or local development. Human societies often solve similar problems in similar ways. Monumental platforms, irrigation, boats, calendars, and stories of destructive floods can arise wherever people live beside rivers, seas, and uncertain weather. A pyramid is a stable form for building upward with stone or earth. It does not require instruction from a vanished mother civilization. Yet Donnelly offered something emotionally satisfying. one origin behind many mysteries. His Atlantis was not only a place, it was a grand explanation. It connected distant ruins, old myths, lost technologies, and the fear that even the greatest civilization could disappear. The idea spread through popular writing, lectures, spiritual movements, and fiction. Soon, Atlantis became whatever an age desired it to be. For some, it was the first empire. For others, a peaceful realm of wisdom. Some imagined advanced machines, forgotten sciences, or powers unsupported by ancient evidence. Occult writers placed Atlantis within elaborate spiritual histories. Later authors describe rival races, psychic abilities, and catastrophes far removed from Plato's text. These claims belonged not to archaeology but to modern myth-making. They also carried troubling ideas. Some versions of Atlantis were used to support racial hierarchies or fantasies of a superior ancestral people who supposedly taught civilization to everyone else. Such theories diminish the achievements of real ancient societies by denying that communities in Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and elsewhere could develop complex cultures through their own long histories. The mystery, once loosened from evidence, could be made to serve almost any purpose. Meanwhile, archaeology continued its slower work. At Troy, excavation revealed not one city, but many, built and rebuilt upon the same mound. At Knossos, Arthur Evans uncovered the remains of a Bronze Age palace and named the civilization Minoan, after the legendary King Minos. In Egypt, tombs, temples, papyri, and settlements added detail to lives long buried beneath royal monuments. Across the Mediterranean, pottery sequences, inscriptions, tools, seeds, bones, and ruined walls allowed scholars to trace change with increasing care. The contrast between archaeology and the Atlantis industry became sharp. Archaeology rarely offers a single dazzling answer. It advances through layers, contexts, comparisons, and revisions. A broken cup matters because of where it was found. A wall matters because it cuts through one floor and lies beneath another. A grain of barley may reveal trade or climate. A harbour basin may show centuries of repair. Atlantis theories often began with the desired conclusion and gathered whatever appeared to support it. Still, even careful scholars could feel the charm of the question. Could Plato have combined elements from several real places? Could memories of earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions, or vanished coastal settlements have entered the story? Might the name, location, or measurements have changed through transmission? These were reasonable questions so long as uncertainty remained visible. One possibility looked not to the Atlantic but to the eastern Mediterranean, where the Bronze Age had ended in upheaval around the 12th century. Before the Common Era, palaces burned, trade networks weakened. Cities were abandoned or reduced. Written systems disappeared in some regions. Movements of peoples, internal rebellions, drought, earthquakes, and warfare may all have contributed, though no single explanation accounts for every place. Egyptian inscriptions from the reigns of Merneptah and Rameses III describe groups later called the Sea Peoples. Their identities and origins remain debated. Some came by ship, others travelled with families and possessions. They fought, settled, traded, or were absorbed into existing populations. Could distant memories of maritime conflict have influenced Plato's invading island power? The idea is possible in a broad sense, but there is no direct chain of evidence. The names, dates, and political circumstances do not align neatly. History offers echoes, not confirmation. Farther west, another dramatic event drew attention: the possible flooding of the Black Sea basin in prehistoric times. Some researchers propose that rising Mediterranean waters broke through the Bosporus and rapidly expanded the Black Sea, drowning inhabited shores. Later studies debated the speed, scale, and direction of the event. Even where major environmental change occurred, linking it specifically to Atlantis remained speculative. The same caution applied to Doggerland, the low plain that once connected Britain with continental Europe. As Ice Age seas rose, rivers, wetlands, hunting grounds, and camps disappeared beneath what became the North Sea. Fishermen have brought up bones, tools, and peat from the submerged landscape. Here was a truly lost country, though not a city of golden walls. Long before Plato, families had walked there beneath open skies. They gathered plants, hunted animals, followed waterways, and made fires on ground now covered by cold grey waves. Their world vanished not in one moral catastrophe, but through rising seas across generations, perhaps punctuated by sudden floods and a great tsunami caused by the Storegga landslide off Norway. Such discoveries altered the meaning of the phrase lost land. The sea had indeed covered places where people once lived. Beneath modern coastlines lay farms, forests, roads, villages, and older landscapes still unnamed. Atlantis did not need to be real for drowned worlds to exist. And as the 20th century opened, new machines were beginning to descend toward them. At first, the machines did not look heroic. They were boxes of wires, heavy instruments, steel spheres, cables, winches, and listening devices lowered over the sides of ships. Their operators worked among wet decks and engine noise, recording faint signals on rolls of paper. Yet with every improvement, the hidden shape of the seabed became clearer. Echo sounding replaced the old weighted line. A pulse of sound travelled downward through the water, struck the bottom and returned. The time between signal and echo revealed the depth. Ships could now trace long profiles across the ocean rather than measure one uncertain point at a time. The results were astonishing. The Atlantic floor contained high ridges, deep valleys, broad plains, volcanic peaks, and long fractures. Later, sonar systems produced increasingly detailed maps. Underwater mountains called seamounts rose thousands of meters from the abyss. Some had flattened tops, showing that waves had once eroded them near sea level before the crust beneath them slowly subsided. To those already convinced that Atlantis had existed, such discoveries appeared to be fragments of a drowned realm. But the ocean floor was telling another story. During the middle decades of the 20th century, evidence from marine geology, earthquakes, magnetism, and the distribution of fossils helped establish the theory of plate tectonics. The surface of the Earth was divided into moving plates. Continents traveled slowly upon them. Ocean basins opened and closed across immense spans of time. New crust formed along ridges while old crust descended into deep trenches elsewhere. The mid-Atlantic ridge was not the ruined backbone of a continent lost a few thousand years ago. It was the active boundary between plates moving apart by only a few centimeters each year. This process was far too slow to resemble Plato's day and night of destruction. Yet it explained why volcanic islands stood in the Atlantic and why earthquakes occurred along certain lines. It also placed limits around what geology could allow. Large islands might suffer eruptions, landslides, or gradual subsidence. Coastal plains might be flooded, but a continent-sized kingdom could not simply drop into the deep ocean within recorded human history without leaving unmistakable evidence. The sea, however, still held many surprises. In 1960, the bathyscaphe Trieste descended into the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench. Two men sat within a small pressure sphere as the vessel sank through darkness to the deepest known part of the ocean. Outside the window, the water carried no sunlight. The hull creaked under enormous pressure. After hours of descent, the craft reached the bottom, proving that human beings could visit a place once imagined as unreachable. Other submersibles followed. Cameras revealed hydrothermal vents, strange animals, underwater lava fields, shipwrecks, and geological landscapes no human eye had seen before. Side-scan sonar began painting broad images of the seabed. Magnetometers detected buried metal. Remotely operated vehicles carried lights and mechanical arms into deep water. Every new technology seemed to renew the promise. Perhaps now Atlantis would be found. Yet the most meaningful discoveries were often smaller and more human. Along drowned coastlines, archaeologists located ancient settlements covered by rising seas. In the eastern Mediterranean, submerged harbors revealed stone quays and anchors. Off Israel, the Neolithic site of Atlit Yam preserved house foundations, wells, graves, and a circle of upright stones beneath several meters of water. Its inhabitants had lived there thousands of years before Plato, when the coastline lay farther west. In Greece, the submerged remains near Pavlopetri showed streets, buildings, courtyards, and tombs lying beneath shallow water off the southern Peloponnese. The settlement had flourished during the Bronze Age and later disappeared beneath the sea, probably through a combination of subsidence, earthquakes, and rising water. A swimmer passing above on a calm morning might see only pale shapes beneath the wavering surface. But from the seabed, walls emerged in orderly lines. Doorways opened toward vanished rooms. Roads led between houses whose roofs and upper stories were gone. Sand settled in corners where families had once stored jars, woven cloth, prepared food, and sheltered from winter winds. This was not Atlantis, it was something more delicate, a real drowned town, built and inhabited by people whose names had not survived. Such places showed how easily memory could gather around a local disaster. Suppose a coastal settlement sank after an earthquake. Survivors might move inland and tell their children of houses beneath the waves. Over generations, the town might grow larger in remembrance. Its buildings might become palaces, its wealth inexhaustible, its destruction sudden and complete. Yet there remained no evidence that Pavlopetri, Atlit Yam, Helike, Thera, or any other known site was a direct source of Plato's tale. The search continued because the story allowed many kinds of seekers to enter it. Some approached with instruments and excavation permits. Some came with theories already complete. Some studied ancient Greek words, asking whether the measurements had been mistranslated or whether years should have been understood as months. Some moved the pillars of Heracles away from Gibraltar to another strait entirely. Others argued that Plato had deliberately altered the location to hide a nearer model. Each adjustment solved one problem while creating another. Reducing 9,000 years to 900 brought Atlantis closer to the Bronze Age, but lacked firm textual support. Moving the pillars eastward made certain Mediterranean islands more convenient, but ignored their usual geographical meaning in Plato's era. Treating the size of the island as an error weakened the very account being used as evidence. A theory could preserve Atlantis only by changing Atlantis. Perhaps that was part of the legend's endurance. Plato supplied enough detail to make the island feel exact, but enough impossibility to prevent easy identification. The rings, canals, plain, mountains, metals, elephants, temples, and western location invite a map. The immense age, vast dimensions, moral structure, and sudden sinking resist one. Through the later 20th century, popular culture transformed the island once more. Novels placed it beneath domes of glass. Films imagined glowing machines and preserved inhabitants. Children encountered it as a city of towers under blue water, visited by fish and drifting rays. Fantasy blended with science fiction until Plato's cautious philosophical myth became a universal image of lost knowledge. The image was beautiful. Far below a moonlit surface, columns stood among coral. Roads vanished into sand, windows opened into darkness. A silent palace waited beneath the currents, untouched since the final night. No archaeologist had found such a place, yet countless people felt they had seen it. Meanwhile, real expeditions crossed the Mediterranean and Atlantic, scanning bays, shelves, calderas, and banks. Headlines repeatedly announced possible discoveries. Circular stones became harbour walls, natural ridges became roads, rectangular sonar marks became buildings. The excitement often faded when later surveys revealed ordinary geology, modern debris, or errors in interpretation. The sea is generous with misleading shapes. Light bends, sound scatters, sediment hides edges and creates others. A low-resolution image can turn a rocky outcrop into a pyramid or a shipwreck into a city block. Careful investigation requires repeated passes, samples, dating, and direct observation. And so the mystery remained where it had always been, suspended between the world Plato described and the world beneath the waves, while each generation listened for an echo and wondered whether it had heard stone. Stone, however, is rarely silent to those who know how to listen. Its minerals reveal where it formed. Its weathered surfaces show whether wind, rain, or waves touched it. Shells trapped nearby can be dated. Pottery fragments can be compared with vessels from distant shores. A wall beneath the sea may preserve the direction of an old street, while a natural ridge, examined closely, may reveal no mark of tools at all. This patient reading of evidence has gradually changed the search for lost places. The question is no longer simply whether a dramatic shape resembles Plato's description. It is whether an entire landscape, with all its ordinary details, belongs to the same time, culture, and environment. A city does not exist through walls alone. It leaves cooking fires, animal bones, broken cups, workshop waste, anchors, drains, roads, grains, burials, and traces of trade. Its harbour contains ballast stones carried from elsewhere. Its houses preserve habits of storage and sleep. Its rubbish records what people ate. Its inscriptions, when they survive, reveal names, measures, debts, prayers, and laws. A civilization powerful enough to conquer much of the Mediterranean would leave evidence beyond its capital. Its pottery would appear in foreign ports. Its weapons, weights, artistic styles, or writing might be copied by neighbors. Enemies would remember it, traders would describe it, shipwrecks would carry its goods into deep water. No such archaeological pattern has been found for Atlantis. This absence does not prove that every image in Plato's story was created without any real inspiration, but it makes the existence of the island empire, exactly as he described it, exceedingly unlikely. The greater the claimed power of a civilization, the more traces it should leave. Plato himself understood the importance of traces and memory. In his story, the Egyptian priests possessed records because Egypt had escaped some of the disasters that erased Greek history. Their temples stood as storehouses of forgotten time. The tale depended upon writing surviving where memory elsewhere had failed. Yet no Egyptian inscription known today describes Atlantis. Egyptian texts preserve many foreign peoples, campaigns, diplomatic exchanges, offerings, voyages, and wonders. They speak of islands and coasts, of rulers from the Aegean, of merchants from the Levant, and of enemies arriving by land and sea. None securely matches Plato's Western Empire or its destruction. The city of Sais, where Solon was said to hear the tale, once stood in the western Nile Delta. It was sacred to the goddess Neith and became especially important during Egypt's late period. Its temples impress Greek visitors, and priests there may indeed have spoken with travelers from across the Mediterranean. Very little of ancient Sais survives above ground. The delta's soil, moisture, rebuilding, and shifting waterways have been unkind to its monuments. Houses and fields now cover much of the old city. One can imagine how easily this loss encourages hope that the missing account still waits below. But hope is not the same as evidence. Solon's journey to Egypt was accepted in ancient tradition, though the details are difficult to establish. He was remembered as a statesman, poet, and traveller who lived generations before Plato. In the Atlantis dialogues, his prestige gives the story dignity, yet no surviving fragment of Solon's own poetry mentions the island. The silence is significant, though not conclusive. Much ancient literature has disappeared. Works once famous are known only from titles or brief quotations. Libraries burned, papyrus decayed, and manuscripts ceased to be copied. It is possible to imagine lost writings that contained almost anything, but historical judgment cannot rest upon what might have vanished. It must begin with what remains. What remains is Plato's text, written for a philosophical purpose in 4th century Athens. It describes a proud naval power that becomes corrupt and attacks a virtuous city. It places moral decline before natural catastrophe. The destruction does not merely remove Atlantis, it confirms the order of the story. The island's geography also serves its meaning. Concentric rings create harmony and control. Canals turn nature into design. Metals, gardens, animals, and springs display abundance. The empire possesses every advantage that ought to ensure security. Yet none of these protections can save a society that has lost restraint. The sea becomes both source and judge. It enriches Atlantis through trade and naval power, then closes over it. The same water that connects the kingdom to distant lands erases its roads and harbours. The island's greatest strength contains the shape of its ending. Greek audiences would have recognized the danger of excess. Their myths often warned that prosperity could breed arrogance. Kings who forgot the limits of human fortune invited reversal. Cities that seemed secure could fall through pride, error, or the turning of fate. Plato gave this familiar pattern an oceanic scale. Still, it may be too simple to say that Atlantis was merely a lesson with no roots in experience. Philosophers do not write outside the world around them. Plato knew of empire. Athens itself had ruled a maritime alliance, collected tribute, and built monuments during its age of power. It had suffered defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Its fleet had been destroyed during the disastrous expedition to Sicily. Political confidence had given way to upheaval. The memory of that failure lay close behind Plato's lifetime. When he described a wealthy sea power reaching beyond proper limits, his audience may have heard an echo of Athens as well as of some imagined enemy. Atlantis was foreign, remote, and magnificent, but it could also reflect the city in which the dialogue was composed. This may explain why Plato set virtuous ancient Athens against corrupted Atlantis. One city represented what Athens might wish to believe about itself. The other represented what power might cause it to become. The mirror worked in both directions. As evening settled over the academy, where Plato taught among gardens and shaded walks beyond the city walls, students may have discussed such meanings beneath the plane trees. Oil lamps would later be lit. A servant might bring bread, olives, or diluted wine. Somewhere beyond the groves, the sounds of Athens softened into the night. Perhaps a listener asked whether Atlantis had truly existed. Plato's answer, if he gave one, has not survived. The unfinished Critias offers no final explanation. Zeus gathers the gods and prepares to speak, but his judgment is lost. The reader is left just before divine punishment, as though the sea itself has washed away the ending. That absence invites us to imagine the last peaceful hours before catastrophe. The harbours of Atlantis are still busy. Lamps shine upon the canals. Horses drink from stone troughs. Merchants count jars in warehouses near the docks. Warm water flows through the baths. In gardens on the central island, leaves stir beneath a mild wind from the ocean. Most people know nothing of imperial councils or moral decline. They are bakers, sailors, potters, gardeners, metal workers, children, servants, farmers, and fishermen. They close shutters, mend nets, sweep floors, and prepare for sleep. This ordinary population appears only faintly in Plato's account, yet any real city would have depended upon them. Grand temples require hands to quarry stone. Fleets require rope makers, carpenters, sail weavers, and cooks. Canals must be dredged. Reservoirs must be cleaned. Fields must be harvested before autumn rains. The imagined city becomes most convincing not in its golden walls, but in these small routines. And perhaps that is why the legend has endured. It allows every listener to stand at the edge of a vanished evening, hearing water move through the rings and wondering whether the people within them ever looked west across the darkening sea and felt for just a moment that their world could not possibly disappear. Yet disappearance is rarely as complete as stories make it seem. A city may fall, but its stones are reused. A language may fade, but words remain in the speech of neighbours. A harbour may silt up while anchors sleep beneath fields that were once water. Even when no monument survives, memory often clings to a place in fragments, a name, a ritual, a road that bends around something no longer visible. Atlantis is unusual because its memory does not behave like the memory of an ordinary lost city. There are no confirmed ruins from which the legend gradually grew. There is no ancient inscription naming its kings, no coin bearing its emblem, no merchant's letter complaining about the price of its copper. Instead, the island arrives almost fully formed within Plato's dialogues, rich in detail and already carrying its moral ending. The silence before Plato is one of the mystery's deepest waters. Greek literature preserves many tales of drowned lands and punished cities. The island of Delos was said to have wandered before being fixed in place. The city of Helike disappeared beneath floodwater. Deucalion survived a great deluge in Greek myth, just as flood stories were told in Mesopotamia and other ancient cultures. Coastal communities knew that water could be both nourishing and destructive. But no surviving Greek writer before Plato clearly describes Atlantis. Herodotus, who wrote about distant peoples, Egyptian customs, western lands, and unusual geography, does not mention it. Thucydides, careful and severe in his account of war and power, says nothing of an ancient Atlantic empire. Homer's poems contain marvelous islands, sea journeys, storms, and kingdoms at the edge of the known world, but not Plato's concentric city. This absence does not make invention certain. Ancient evidence is incomplete, yet it suggests that Atlantis was not a widely shared legend waiting for Plato merely to record it. The form in which we know it seems to belong strongly to him. And still the possibility of older influences remains. Plato may have drawn upon accounts of Egypt, memories of Persian imperial power, stories of Western wealth, the destruction of Helike, the naval ambition of Athens, and inherited myths of flood and divine punishment. These elements need not come from a single source. A storyteller can gather many pieces until they seem to belong to one vanished world. The process is much like building a harbour wall. One stone comes from a quarry nearby. Another was taken from an older temple. A third arrived as ballast in a merchant ship. Once fitted together, they form a new structure, and only careful examination reveals their separate origins. Atlantis may be such a structure of the imagination. Its elephants suggest lands beyond the ordinary Greek horizon. Its metals recall the wealth of Iberia and other Western regions. Its canals and ordered plain may echo Egypt or Mesopotamia, where water was carefully managed. Its naval empire resembles powers that had dominated the Mediterranean. Its destruction resembles earthquakes and floods remembered from real experience. Together, these fragments create something that never existed in exactly that form, yet feels as though it might have. That feeling has inspired generations of searchers to read Plato as a coded guide. They measure the rings, compare coastlines, study ancient units, and trace possible errors in transmission. Some believe the number 9,000 became exaggerated through translation. Others suggest that Atlantis was not an island but a peninsula, or that the phrase beyond the pillars carried a meaning now lost. Every proposal begins by asking which details should be kept and which may be changed. If the western location is preserved, then Thera becomes difficult. If the circular harbours are preserved, many proposed sites fail. If the immense date is preserved, advanced cities of the required kind are unknown. If the Bronze Age setting is preferred, then the 9,000 years must be reduced. If the scale of the empire is accepted, the absence of widespread material evidence becomes harder to explain. The story resists being placed because its details do not gather naturally in one landscape. Perhaps they were never meant to. Plato's readers were accustomed to arguments presented through imagined conversations. A speaker might tell a myth not because every event was historically verifiable, but because the tale allowed a truth to be seen from another angle. The question was not always, did this happen exactly as described? It could also be, what does this reveal about justice, order, desire, and the weakness of human institutions? Atlantis reveals a civilization that possesses nearly everything except wisdom enough to remain content. Its people inherit abundance, but inheritance is not the same as virtue. Their ancestors built laws and rituals to restrain power. Later generations keep the outer forms while losing the inner purpose. Ceremonies continue, temples still shine, the canals remain full of ships, yet the meaning of restraint has thinned. This is a quiet kind of collapse. Before walls fall, judgment weakens. Before harbours sink, ambition expands. The catastrophe at the end is sudden, but the true decline takes place slowly, almost invisibly, in the habits of those who believe prosperity proves their goodness. That lesson required no literal island, but the power of the lesson depends upon the island feeling real, and so Plato gives it springs of hot and cold water. He gives it racetracks, docks, bridges, guard towers, orchards, mines, and a plain measured into districts. He describes the sacrifice of bulls and the gathering of kings. He lets the listener see red, black, and white stone cut from beneath the rings. The detail acts like lamplight upon a room. It does not prove the room exists beyond the story, but while the light remains, one can imagine every object within it. Modern readers often separate fact and fiction sharply. Ancient writers could move more easily between history, myth, philosophy, and inherited tradition. A story might be offered as true within the dialogue while still serving a symbolic purpose larger than chronology. This does not mean Plato intended to deceive. He may have believed that noble fictions could express realities that ordinary argument could not. He may have adapted a genuine tale beyond recognition. He may have invented Atlantis almost entirely. The surviving text permits several possibilities, though not all are equally supported. The simplest explanation is that Atlantis was Plato's creation. shaped from the materials of the ancient world. Yet simple explanations do not always quiet the imagination. At night, the Atlantic does not look like an argument. It looks like a vast, dark plain, breathing beneath the stars. Beyond the reach of shorelights, waves rise and fall over mountain ranges no sailor can see. Trenches descend into cold shadow. Volcanoes build islands and break them apart. Sand covers wrecks, walls, and old coastlines. There are still places below where human feet once walked. The existence of those drowned landscapes keeps the door slightly open. Not to Plato's empire exactly, but to the deeper truth beneath the legend. The world has lost more places than history remembers. A village may vanish without a philosopher to name it. A harbour may sink before its people learn to write. An island community may scatter after an eruption, carrying only songs, family stories, and the memory of a mountain that no longer has the same shape. Centuries later, those memories may be impossible to separate from myth. Perhaps, somewhere in the long background of Atlantis, there was such a memory. Not a continent of kings and elephants, not a universal mother civilization, but a shoreline broken by earthquake, a town drowned by a sudden wave, or an island abandoned beneath falling ash. The survivors might have looked back from their boats and watched smoke cover the place where morning had begun. The sea would have hidden the rest, and far above that forgotten shore, the waves would continue their slow work, smoothing the boundary between what had happened, what was remembered, and what later generations needed the story to mean. The need for meaning has always accompanied the search. Some seekers hoped Atlantis would prove that human civilization was far older than historians believed. Others wished to find a forgotten source of wisdom, a first homeland from which all later cultures had descended. Still others were drawn by the simple romance of ruins beneath blue water, where silence might preserve what the noisy surface world had lost. But the strongest mysteries are not always those with hidden answers. Sometimes they endure because they gather many questions into one shape. Atlantis asks how much of the past can vanish. It asks whether a powerful society can mistake wealth for permanence. It asks how stories change as they cross languages and centuries. It asks why people often prefer one dazzling lost civilization to the slower, more complicated histories revealed by archaeology. Those histories are filled with real wonders. There was no need for Atlantean teachers to explain the pyramids of Egypt. Their construction grew from generations of local experimentation, royal authority, skilled labor, religious belief, stoneworking, transport, mathematics, and administration. There was no need for a vanished Atlantic empire to account for the cities of Mesopotamia, the planned settlements of the Indus Valley, the ceremonial centers of Mesoamerica, or the monumental landscapes of the Andes. Each emerged through its own sequence of choices, challenges, exchanges, and inherited knowledge. The desire to connect them all to Atlantis can make the ancient world seem smaller than it was. It replaces many human stories with one. It turns independent invention into imitation and makes forgotten islanders responsible for achievements that belong to real peoples whose descendants still carry their histories. The past is richer when allowed to remain plural. Across coastlines and river valleys, communities learn to manage water, shape stone, observe the heavens, preserve grain, organize labor, and send boats beyond familiar shores. Sometimes they borrowed from neighbors, sometimes they developed similar solutions independently. Sometimes their experiments failed, sometimes their cities flourished for centuries and then declined through a mixture of environmental change, political tension, economic disruption, migration, and war. Rarely did one cause explain everything. Plato's Atlantis, by contrast, offers a complete pattern. Virtue declines, ambition grows, judgment arrives. the island sinks. Its clarity is one reason it feels so satisfying. Real collapse is often less orderly. The Minoan palaces did not all disappear in the same hour. The Bronze Age world changed unevenly. Some settlements burned while others survived. Trade routes shifted, new rulers appeared. Languages continued or vanished. Families adapted to conditions that would only much later be called the end of an age. Even the destruction of a city could be followed by rebuilding. Helike remained remembered beneath the waters, but nearby communities continued. Thera's eruption shattered part of an island, yet people returned to Santorini in later centuries. Earthquakes damaged ancient towns repeatedly, and inhabitants repaired walls upon older foundations until another generation faced the same trembling ground. Human life gathers around ruins with surprising speed. A collapsed house becomes a source of stone, a flooded field becomes a fishing ground, a broken temple becomes a landmark. Children play where adults remember fear. The catastrophe that defines a place in later history may have been only one season among many to those who survived it. This gentle persistence is mostly absent from Atlantis because Plato's tale requires finality. The island must vanish so completely that its wealth cannot be recovered and its empire cannot return. The sea closes the moral account, yet even within the imagined catastrophe, one may wonder whether everyone was lost. Plato says Atlantis sank, but stories of total destruction often leave room for survivors beyond the frame. Sailors might have been abroad. Merchants might have remained in foreign ports. Farmers in distant territories might have escaped the worst. If Atlantis had been a real empire, fragments of its people would have continued elsewhere, carrying language, craft, memory, and grief. This possibility inspired many later theories. Atlantean refugees were imagined founding civilizations across the world, but no evidence supports such migrations, and the idea belongs to modern elaboration rather than Plato's surviving account. Still, the human image is difficult to dismiss. A ship at sea feels the shock beneath its hull. The crew sees an unnatural cloud on the horizon. Birds fly outward over the water. Ash begins to fall in soft grey grains upon the deck. When the sailors return, the coast they know is gone. No golden empire is needed for such a scene to have occurred somewhere in the ancient world. Volcanic islands have collapsed. Tsunamis have crossed seas. Earthquakes have lowered coasts and raised others. Storm surges have destroyed harbours. River deltas have shifted, leaving cities stranded inland or buried beneath mud. The Mediterranean itself preserves many submerged remains because its shores have always been restless. Near Alexandria, ruins associated with ancient royal and harbour districts lie beneath the water, lowered by subsidence, earthquakes, and changes along the coast. Columns, statues, foundations, and blocks rest among sand and marine growth where boats once approached the city. At Baiae in the Bay of Naples, Roman villas, mosaics, roads, and bath complexes sank gradually because of volcanic movements in the land. Today, divers can pass above patterned floors where wealthy Romans once walked through sunlit rooms. These places possess something Atlantis does not: context. Their stones match known architecture. Their pottery belongs to datable periods. Their locations fit ancient texts and local geology. Their rise and submergence can be studied through evidence that agrees across many fields. The work is patient, and patience rarely produces the sudden revelation imagined in adventure stories. A team may spend years mapping a harbour wall. Divers move slowly through cloudy water, careful not to disturb sediment. Measurements are recorded, photographs overlap to create detailed models. Samples are raised, conserved, and compared. A single wooden post may reveal the date of a key. A handful of seeds may show what was stored nearby. The romance remains, but it is quieter. It lives in the moment when a shape beneath sand proves to be a threshold, or when a worn stone bears the groove of a rope pulled there centuries ago. It lives in knowing that ordinary hands touched the same surface before the water rose. Perhaps Atlantis endures partly because it leads people toward these real drowned worlds. A child first hears of a city beneath the sea and later learns of Akrotiri, Pavlopetri, Doggerland, Helike, Baiae, or the ancient shores now hidden below the Black Sea and North Sea. The legend becomes a doorway into geology, archaeology, philosophy, and the study of memory. The doorway does not have to open onto Atlantis itself. It may open instead onto a beach at low tide, where dark peat lies exposed between pools. Within it are roots from a forest that grew when the sea stood far away. Nearby, a worked flint rests among shells. The waves move in and out, covering the old ground again. For a few minutes, the lost landscape breathes at the surface. Then the tide returns and the boundary closes. Beyond the returning tide, the sea continues to keep its own archive. It preserves some things with extraordinary care and destroys others without ceremony. Wood sealed beneath mud may survive for thousands of years, while exposed stone is slowly bored by shellfish and softened by salt. Iron becomes a reddish crust, rope vanishes, pottery endures in fragments. A ship may settle upright into the seabed or break apart across a wide field of sand until only its cargo reveals that a vessel was ever there. For underwater archaeologists, this uneven survival is both gift and difficulty. A lost city would not wait below in perfect stillness. Currents would move sediment through streets. Earthquakes might scatter walls. Marine life would cover carved surfaces. Later anchors could damage ancient remains. Fishing nets might drag objects from their original places. In shallow water, storms could rearrange an entire site within a single night. The deeper ocean offers protection from waves, but it creates other obstacles. Pressure grows, light disappears, cold slows decay but makes human work difficult. Vast distances separate one feature from another, and even the most advanced sonar can miss objects hidden beneath layers of sediment. This is why claims of Atlantis discovered on the seabed must be treated carefully. A geometric pattern in a sonar image may be produced by the instrument's movement. Parallel lines may come from modern survey tracks. Blocks may prove to be fractured rock. A supposed road may be a natural lava formation, its edges made regular by cooling and erosion. Near the Japanese island of Yonaguni, for example, a striking underwater formation has often been described as a submerged monument. It contains broad terraces, sharp angles, and step-like surfaces. Some observers believe people modified parts of it, while many geologists consider its main form natural, created by fractures in layered sandstone. Even there, where the site can be visited and examined, interpretation remains debated. It bears little resemblance to Plato's Atlantis in place, age, or cultural setting. Yet its fame reveals how quickly ordered stone beneath water becomes attached to the most famous lost city of all. Another celebrated formation lies near the island of Bimini in the Bahamas. Rows of large limestone blocks known as the Bimini Road were once presented as the remains of an ancient wall or harbour. Geological study, however, indicates that they are beach rock fractured along natural joints and later submerged as sea level rose. To the eye, the stones can seem purposeful. They lie in a line beneath warm, clear water. Sunlight moves across their surfaces. Fish pass through gaps that resemble doorways. A diver may run a hand along one broad edge and feel the unmistakable impression of masonry. But nature also builds with repetition. Crystals form angles, basalt cools into columns, sedimentary layers break into slabs, wind carves arches, and waves arrange stones by size. Human design is not the only source of order in the world. The distinction between natural and artificial forms becomes clearer when context is present. A single line of blocks may be uncertain. A line accompanied by tools, pottery, prepared foundations, quarries, worked surfaces, and datable occupation layers becomes far more persuasive. Atlantis hunters have often searched for one dramatic feature: the rings, the canal, the wall, the mountain, the harbour. Archaeology looks for the web around it. Where did the builders live? What did they eat? How did they bury their dead? What kinds of boats entered the harbour? What material was traded? Which writing system recorded their accounts? What neighbouring cultures mentioned them? How does the site fit the local geology? The lack of these surrounding answers has caused every proposed Atlantis to fade under close examination. Still, the desire to find it remains gentle in many people. Not every seeker wishes to prove a grand theory or overturn history. Some simply hope that the world has not yet surrendered all its secrets. And it has not. New settlements continue to be discovered beneath lakes, rivers, marshes, deserts, forests, and seas. Remote sensing reveals buried roads, drought exposes old foundations, fishermen raise artifacts in their nets, divers find wrecks after storms move the sand. Each discovery changes the map of the past a little. In the North Sea, cores taken from the seabed help reconstruct the rivers and wetlands of Doggerland. In the Mediterranean, underwater surveys trace ancient ports now distant from the modern shoreline. Around the Black Sea, exceptionally preserved shipwrecks rest in deep, oxygen-poor water, their masts and planks surviving from ages when such vessels were known mostly through paintings and fragments. None is Atlantis, yet each brings the vanished world closer. A wooden ship discovered in darkness can reveal how sailors shaped planks, fastened joints, arranged cargo, and trusted their lives to a hull no thicker than a hand. A submerged village can show where a family placed its hearth. A drowned field boundary can reveal that someone once divided land where fish now swim. The past is not hidden only in palaces. It waits in worn thresholds, cooking pots, pollen, fishhooks, storage pits, and the dark outlines of posts that supported roofs. These modest traces are less dazzling than walls of orichalcum, but they carry the warmth of real presence. Perhaps the legend of Atlantis becomes most meaningful when it teaches us to notice them. Plato's island was imagined through splendor. Archaeology restores history through fragments. One offers a perfect shape, destroyed in a single catastrophe. The other offers imperfect survival, enough pieces to know that people lived, worked, worried, celebrated, repaired, travelled, and remembered. That difference is important. A perfect lost city can become whatever later ages desire. A real site resists us. Its evidence sets limits. It may contradict a beautiful theory. It may reveal that life was poorer, stranger, or more ordinary than expected. But within those limits lies something more precious than fantasy, the nearness of lives that truly unfolded. Late in the day, an archaeological vessel may end its survey and turn toward harbour. Equipment is secured, screens go dark, the sea, recently covered with grids and measurements, becomes once again a field of evening light. Behind the ship, the wake spreads and fades. Below, the seabed remains unchanged by the day's questions. Ancient channels lie beneath mud, Wrecks lean into sediment. Stone walls continue beneath marine grass. Most will never be given famous names. The horizon grows violet. A first star appears above the water, and somewhere between the mapped ridges and the unexamined depths, Atlantis drifts on, not as a location waiting patiently for a flag, but as a question that each generation carries to the shore, listening to the waves and wondering how much of the human story has passed beyond memory. The question reaches farther than Atlantis. It touches every place where land and water exchange their boundaries. Along deltas, rivers build new ground from silt, then abandon old channels. Along volcanic coasts, lava creates black promontories that waves begin to dismantle at once. In the far north, shorelines rise slowly as land once pressed down by ice continues to rebound. Elsewhere, coasts sink by degrees, and people rebuild sea walls against water that returns a little higher each generation. To ancient communities, these movements had no single explanation. An earthquake might be understood as the action of a god beneath the earth. A flood might signal divine displeasure, an imbalance in nature, or the return of a chaos older than the ordered world. Priests, poets, and philosophers gave disaster meanings that geology would later express in different language. Poseidon, who founded Atlantis in Plato's myth, was not only lord of the sea. In Greek belief, he was also associated with earthquakes and horses. His power joined the stable-looking earth to the restless water beside it. A city blessed by Poseidon could therefore be imagined as both protected and vulnerable, built within the domain of the very god whose forces might undo it. The choice was fitting. Atlantis rose through mastery of water. Its concentric canals controlled access to the capital. Its fleets carried influence across the sea. Its springs supplied baths and gardens. Its great plain was crossed by channels laid out with human precision. Yet water never belonged completely to those who shaped it. Canals silted, harbours required repair. Storms breached embankments, springs shifted after tremors, salt entered fields. The very systems that made a city prosperous demanded constant attention from generations of workers. Plato's description lingers upon order, but beneath that order one can sense the labour required to maintain it. Before dawn, gatekeepers would open passages between harbour districts. Dock workers would guide vessels toward berths, surveyors would inspect banks after winter rain. Farmers would clear weeds from irrigation channels. Stone cutters would replace blocks loosened by moisture. Boat builders would bend timber, seal seams, and repair hulls worn by long voyages. The city's famous rings would not be symbols alone. They would be lived spaces filled with inconvenience, noise, smell, and routine. In an outer harbour, a sailor might wake beneath a woolen cloak, hearing ropes knock against a mast. Nearby, someone would be heating a simple meal over a small brazier. Gulls would gather above fish waste along the quay. Merchants would argue quietly over damaged jars. Officials would count cargo and record dues. Farther inward, gardens would receive water from channels cut with deliberate slope. Servants would sweep courtyards faced with coloured stone. In workshops, copper would glow in furnaces and the air would carry charcoal smoke. Horses would stamp in shaded stalls near the racetrack. Children would pause beside bridges to watch foreign ships pass below. None of these people would think of themselves as characters in a warning. They would think about weather, prices, family obligations, sore hands, leaking roofs, and the arrival of ships expected before sunset. The moral shape of Atlantis belongs to the storyteller looking back. Daily life, even in a doomed city, would have remained stubbornly immediate. This is true of real cities overtaken by disaster. At Pompeii, scratch notices remained on walls. Bread sat in ovens. Tools lay in workshops. At Akrotiri, storage vessels stood where inhabitants had used them. At drowned coastal sites, wells, floors, and hearths survived because ordinary life stopped before objects could be gathered and moved. The surviving details are powerful because they were never intended as messages to the future. A cup placed beside a sleeping area was only a cup. A basket of grain was meant for winter. A lamp waited to be lit after dark. Time transformed these humble things into evidence. Atlantis offers no such evidence, but Plato understood the persuasive force of practical detail. His account includes measurements, building materials, districts, laws, resources, and ceremonies. The reader is encouraged to imagine that the speaker has access to a record more exact than legend usually provides. This precision has often been mistaken for proof, yet invented places can be carefully measured. Philosophers can design cities on paper. Poets can describe buildings that no mason ever raised. The presence of numbers does not guarantee the existence of what they count. Indeed, the numbers in the Atlantis story sometimes seem shaped by order and symbolism. 10 royal brothers divide the island. Rings surround the sacred center. The plane is arranged into regular units. The structure reflects a mind concerned with geometry, hierarchy, and the relationship between harmony and rule. The city begins as an image of control. Its rulers inherit a world already organized around a protected center. Sea and land alternate in balanced circles. Resources appear in abundance. Authority passes through a sacred family. Laws bind the kings together. But balance cannot be inherited forever. Plato suggests that order weakens not because the canals fail or the harvests diminish, but because character changes. The Atlanteans continue to possess the outward form of greatness after losing the inward quality that once made greatness safe. Their decline would not necessarily be visible at first. The temple would still shine. The fleet would still depart in formation. Taxes would still arrive from distant provinces. Festivals would continue. Musicians would play. Bulls would be led into ceremonial enclosures. Ambassadors would bow before rulers whose halls appeared more splendid than ever. Only gradually would moderation seem old-fashioned. A larger palace would be built beside an older one. A governor would demand more tribute. A successful admiral would return with captives, metals, timber, and promises of richer lands beyond the next coast. Councillors who urged restraint would be dismissed as timid. The empire would continue to expand because it could. And from the high central island, where the temple of Poseidon stood above the rings, the outer sea would seem calm enough to carry any ambition placed upon it. Beyond the harbour mouth, the fleet would spread across the western water. The first ships might carry envoys rather than soldiers. They would enter foreign ports beneath bright sails, bearing gifts, polished metalwork, jars of fragrant oil, dyed cloth, and promises of friendship. Their captains would speak of shared prosperity. Their scribes would record the depth of channels, the position of storehouses, the condition of walls, and the loyalties of local rulers. Trade and power often traveled together in the ancient world. A harbour that welcomed merchants could later receive officials. A treaty might become an obligation. A request for protection might lead to permanent garrisons. Tribute presented as gratitude could harden into tax. Over time, the symbols of Atlantis would appear in distant marketplaces, on seals, weights, and the prows of ships. Plato gives few details of this expansion. He tells us only that the island's rulers controlled other islands and parts of the continent, then attempted to subdue the lands within the Mediterranean. The silence leaves room for the slow machinery of empire. One can imagine the growing network by its sounds. Hammers ring in shipyards from dawn until sunset. Forests farther inland are marked for timber. Rope walks stretch along dusty ground where fibers are twisted into heavy cable. Sailcloth is measured and folded. Bronze fittings arrive from furnaces. Warehouses fill with grain for crews who may be gone through an entire season. At first, prosperity seems to touch everyone. Fishermen sell more of their catch. Potters receive orders for storage jars. Farmers provide barley, olives, and dried fruit to naval suppliers. Young men find work aboard merchant vessels. Foreign goods appear in the markets: carved ivory, amber, spices, fine wool, unusual shells, and stones whose colors suggest distant mountains. The city becomes louder and more crowded. Languages from across the Western Sea mingle along the quays. Inns remain open after dark. Money changes hands beneath awnings. New districts grow beyond the older walls, and houses rise upon land reclaimed from marshy edges. Temples receive offerings from captains grateful for safe return, yet abundance has its shadow. Prices rise. Wealth gathers unevenly. Families who once owned modest plots lose them through debt. Officials enrich themselves by controlling contracts and harbour fees. Provincial governors send gifts to the capital, knowing that generosity may secure another term of command. The rulers continue to meet according to ancient law. Within the sanctuary of Poseidon, they assemble at appointed intervals. Plato describes them hunting a bull without iron weapons, capturing it among the temple's sacred herd, and sacrificing it beside a pillar inscribed with the laws of their ancestor. The kings mix blood with wine, swear obedience to the commands, judge one another's conduct, and drink from golden cups. The ceremony is solemn, but ceremonies can survive after belief has weakened. A king may speak the proper words while already planning how to evade them. Another may condemn excess in public and commission a larger residence in private. A third may warn against war, then agree to it when offered a greater share of tribute. The pillar remains, the oaths remain, the old gestures remain. Only restraint begins to vanish. Plato's description of decline is brief, almost gentle. The Atlanteans appear glorious and blessed to those unable to see clearly, while in truth they have become filled with unjust desire and power. Their corruption is not announced by ruined streets or empty granaries. It hides beneath success. This makes the story more unsettling than a tale of simple decay. Atlantis does not invade because it is desperate. It invades because it has more than enough and still desires more. Its rulers possess fertile land, rich mines, skilled workers, protected harbours, strong laws, and the respect of neighbouring peoples. Their failure comes from the inability to recognise sufficiency. Across the sea, reports of their approach would arrive before the fleet itself. A merchant ship reaches a Greek harbour after a difficult passage. Its crew speaks of western ports brought under Atlantean rule. Another vessel reports new taxes imposed upon islands. Refugees carry stories of councils dissolved and local leaders replaced. Some accounts are exaggerated, others incomplete, but together they create unease. In Plato's imagined ancient Athens, the city prepares quietly. This Athens bears little resemblance to the crowded naval democracy of the 5th century before the Common Era. It is an idealized community, ordered according to principles Plato admired. The land is broader and more fertile than in his own time. Its guardians live modestly, separated from private wealth, trained to defend the whole city rather than advance their families. The Acropolis in this distant age is not yet crowned by the marble temples familiar to later history. Springs rise from the earth, fields spread beyond the settlement, craftspeople work near their homes. Shepherds move across the surrounding hills, where the soil has not yet been worn thin by centuries of cultivation and erosion. News of Atlantis passes through this landscape like a change in weather. Messengers travel the roads, assemblies gather. Storehouses are checked, coastal watchpoints are strengthened. Allies debate whether resistance is possible. Some choose submission, hoping to preserve their cities. Others wait, uncertain which side will prevail. The Athenians stand alone not because they possess the greatest fleet or richest treasury, but because Plato wishes courage and justice to face power without disguise. No surviving part of the dialogue describes the decisive struggle in detail. There is no catalogue of ships, no long battle speech, no account of shattered armour or burning towns. The absence is fitting for a story told beside the edge of sleep. What matters is not the violence of the contest, but the contrast between the two societies. The empire advances through appetite, the smaller city resists through measure. Perhaps the confrontation takes place across several seasons. Atlantean ships enter the Mediterranean in waves, using friendly harbours and conquered islands as stations. Their commanders expect fear to accomplish what force has not yet begun. Many gates open before them. Athens refuses. Its defenders know the sea routes, the narrow passages, the changing winds between islands. Farmers carry supplies to the coast. Potters shape water jars. Smiths repair tools and fittings. Women manage households and store grain while relatives serve beyond the city. Older citizens remember local paths through hills where larger forces cannot move easily. The victory, when it comes, is described only in its consequence. The Atlantean advance is stopped, subject peoples are freed. The proud Western Empire discovers that wealth and numbers do not make conquest inevitable. For one quiet interval, ancient Athens stands triumphant. Then the earth begins to move. At first, the movement is slight. A cup trembles upon a shelf. Water quivers in a basin. Dust loosens from the edge of a doorway and drifts through a shaft of morning light. In the stables, horses lift their heads and pull against their tethers. Dogs begin to bark in courtyards where no stranger has entered. Then the ground rolls beneath the city, walls creak, roof tiles slip. People hurry into open spaces, carrying children, blankets, and whatever small possessions their hands can reach. The first shock passes, leaving an unnatural stillness behind it. Birds rise from the fields. Along the coast, fishermen stare toward the water. The sea has begun to withdraw. Harbours that had been deep enough for ships now reveal wet stone, stranded fish, anchors, and channels of glistening mud. Vessels tilt against their moorings. People descend toward the exposed shore, uncertain whether they are witnessing a wonder or a warning. Farther west, around the rings of Atlantis, the same strange retreat would be even more dramatic. Water drains from the canals. Ships settle unevenly against the quays. The central harbour empties until its carefully cut walls stand bare in the pale light. Springs continue to flow, but the ocean beyond the canal appears to have drawn a long breath. No one in Plato's age understood tsunamis as later science would describe them. Ancient observers knew that earthquakes and sudden floods could arrive together, but the movement of energy through the sea remained mysterious. A wave might be interpreted as the anger of Poseidon, the overturning of natural order, or the final sign of a judgment already spoken among the gods. The people of Atlantis would have only moments to decide where safety might lie. Some would run toward higher ground on the central island. Others would return home for relatives. Sailors might try to cut ships free, believing deep water safer than stone. Officials would shout contradictory instructions. Temple servants would carry sacred objects from the sanctuary. Horses would refuse bridges shaking beneath their hooves. And beyond the outermost ring, the horizon would change. The returning water would not resemble an ordinary wave curling upon a beach. It would rise as a moving wall, dark with sediment, timber, boats, and fragments of the coast. The first sound might be a low, continuous roar, deeper than wind, growing until every other voice disappeared beneath it. Plato gives no such scene. He offers only the compressed power of catastrophe, earthquakes and floods, one dreadful day and night, the island swallowed by the sea. The details belong to imagination, and they must remain there. No surviving account describes the faces, choices, or final hours of Atlantis, because no evidence confirms that such hours ever occurred. Yet, real disasters allow us to understand why his few words have remained so vivid. In the year 373 before the Common Era, when Helike was destroyed, the sea swept across the coastal plain after an earthquake. Ancient writers later describe buildings submerged and the city lost beneath water. In 365 of the Common Era, a major earthquake near Crete generated a tsunami that struck shores across the eastern Mediterranean. Alexandria suffered heavily. Ships were carried inland and coastal districts were overwhelmed. Long before either event, the eruption of Thera had sent destructive waves through parts of the Aegean. Long after Plato, earthquakes would repeatedly damage cities from Greece to Sicily, from Anatolia to North Africa. The Mediterranean looks enclosed and calm upon a map, but beneath it the earth remains active. Africa presses slowly toward Eurasia. Faults bend beneath islands and coasts. Volcanoes rise where rock melts below the surface. Most movement is too gradual to feel, but sometimes accumulated strain releases in moments. A city may spend centuries building upward and lose entire districts before sunset. For Plato, the destruction of Atlantis and ancient Athens serves a different scale of thought. Both sides of the war are removed. The aggressor sinks beneath the ocean. The victorious defenders are swallowed by the earth. Neither city receives the future it expects. The ending is not a celebration of conquest. It is a reminder that even virtue does not grant control over nature, and even triumph cannot preserve a society forever. Human justice may matter deeply, yet human works remain fragile beneath forces older than law and empire. In the imagined aftermath, the Western Sea is covered with mud and debris. Ships attempting to cross find the passage difficult or impossible. The rings of Atlantis disappear beneath turbulent water. Towers fall, bridges break. The temple at the center vanishes into foam and darkness. For a time, fragments may remain at the surface: roof beams, jars, doors, baskets, branches, broken masts, and pieces of carved wood drift through the grey water. Survivors, if there are any, cling to wreckage or reach high ground on distant slopes. Ash or rain dims the sky. The sea carries familiar objects away from the places that gave them meaning. Then the weather changes, clouds pass, waves continue, debris scatters. The ocean returns to its usual rhythm, indifferent to the names once spoken along its shore. This is how a lost city begins to become a legend. Those who escape tell what they saw. Their accounts differ. One remembers the earth opening, another remembers the sea retreating. Another insists that fire appeared in the sky. The wealthy speak of palaces and temples. Sailors speak of currents and shattered fleets. Farmers remember fields covered with salt. Children hear the story from adults who pause in the middle because certain images remain too difficult to describe. Years pass, and the survivors grow old. The city becomes more beautiful in memory. Its canals are wider, its walls brighter, its kings more powerful. The catastrophe becomes shorter and more complete. Details that no one witnessed are added because every ending seeks an explanation. Later generations ask why such a place was destroyed. Some answer that the gods were angry, some say the rulers had grown proud, some say the people had broken ancient laws. The disaster, once meaningless and terrifying, acquires a moral shape. This is one possible way that myths are born, though it cannot be proven for Atlantis. A real event leaves grief. Grief becomes memory. Memory becomes story. Story becomes tradition. Tradition is reshaped by those who need it to answer the questions of their own age. By the time the tale reaches a philosopher, the city may no longer resemble the place from which the first memory came. Or perhaps there was no first city at all. Perhaps Plato began with the lesson and built the island around it, adding the texture of known disasters until invention felt like remembrance. The result would be no less skillful. Indeed, the absence of a real Atlantis may explain why the story fits so many places without belonging completely to any of them. Thera offers the volcano. Helike offers the drowned city. Athens offers the warning of imperial ambition. Egypt offers the authority of age and preserved records. The Atlantic offers distance, mystery, and a horizon beyond which almost anything might once have stood. Plato gathers them into one slow-moving vision. A civilization arranged in perfect circles, blessed with abundance, corrupted by desire and taken by the sea. When the shaking ends, there is no final witness to explain what remains below. Only water passes over the vanished rings, carrying silt into the harbours and settling, grain by grain, upon the roads. Beneath that settling layer, the city would begin to lose its name. The first winter storms would tear loose whatever the earthquake had left standing. Roof beams would drift away or sink into deeper channels. Courtyard walls would tilt and fall. Bronze doors, if any had survived, would disappear beneath sand and fragments of masonry. Fish would enter rooms that had once held lamps, woven cloth, and the quiet possessions of families. Years would pass, then generations. The outline of the outer harbour would soften. The canal leading toward the open sea would narrow beneath silt. Bridges would collapse into the water below them, and the coloured stone of the inner walls would gather shells along its edges. Gardens would vanish first beneath salt, then beneath mud. Springs might continue to rise, their warm and cold waters mixing with the sea until no one remained to remember which bath had belonged to kings and which to ordinary citizens. If survivors returned, they might find no place to land. Perhaps they would circle above the drowned plain in small boats, searching for the hill where the temple once stood. They might recognize a mountain beyond the coast or the direction of sunset over a familiar channel. Yet every nearer landmark would be altered. A tower could become a reef. A marketplace could lie beneath water too deep to see through. They would carry the city away in memory because they could no longer carry it in stone. At first, their accounts might be careful. They would remember which bridge had broken, where the first wave entered, and which road led toward higher ground. They would speak the names of relatives, neighbours, merchants, and sailors who did not return. They would describe the colour of the sky and the taste of ash or salt in the air. But memory changes when it must survive without a place. Children born elsewhere would know Atlantis only through evening stories. They would imagine the rings wider than they had been, the temple taller, the walls brighter. They would ask whether every house had been rich, whether every harbour had been filled with ships, whether the rulers had understood what was coming. The older survivors might answer differently each time. One would say the destruction came without warning. Another would insist there had been signs, trembling earth, unusual tides, birds flying inland. A priest might say the ancient laws had been neglected. A sailor might blame the ambition of kings. A farmer might remember only that the sea covered the fields before the grain could be harvested. In this way, catastrophe becomes meaning. The mind resists a disaster without reason. It looks for a broken oath, a proud ruler, a forgotten ritual, or a boundary crossed too many times. The greater the loss, the stronger the desire to believe that the world had given some warning before it changed. Plato's Atlantis carries this moral order within it. The island does not sink at random. Its destruction follows corruption. Wealth becomes appetite, appetite becomes conquest, and conquest is answered by the earth and sea. Yet nature does not always wait for a moral lesson. Real earthquakes strike cities where people are generous and cities where they are cruel. Waves cross fields without asking who owns them. Volcanoes bury workshops, temples, kitchens, and children's toys beneath the same ash. Geological forces do not distinguish between a wise household and a foolish king. The moral belongs to the storyteller. That does not make it meaningless. It reveals what the storyteller wishes the disaster to teach. For Plato, no abundance could protect a society that abandoned moderation. No fleet could master every horizon. No system of canals, laws, temples, and inherited authority could remain just by design alone. Order had to be renewed through character. And when character failed, magnificent structures became empty shells. The image would have carried special weight in Athens. The city had known confidence, naval power, tribute, monumental building, and imperial reach. It had also known plague, defeat, political violence, and the destruction of its fleet. Plato did not need a surviving Atlantic ruin to understand how quickly greatness could turn into memory. He had watched people argue about the causes of collapse. Some blamed poor leaders, some blamed the crowd, some blamed ambition, luxury, bad education, or the failure of law. Every explanation revealed as much about the speaker as about the past. Atlantis allowed these questions to be moved to a safe distance. It was not Athens, yet it resembled Athens in uncomfortable ways. It was not Persia, though it possessed imperial scale. It was not Minoan Crete, though it ruled through the sea. It was not Egypt, though its ordered plain and canals suggested a landscape mastered by water. It was a city assembled from echoes. This may be why no proposed location has ever contained all its features. The rings appear in one place, the volcanic destruction in another, the Western metals somewhere else, and the imperial memory in yet another. Searchers gather these pieces and try to force them onto a single map, but perhaps the map was always philosophical. Its center was not a hill enclosed by canals. Its center was the problem of power. Around that problem, Plato arranged his rings: wealth, order, inheritance, ambition, conquest, judgment, loss. Each circle led inward toward the same question: what becomes of a society when its success teaches it that limits no longer apply? The question was ancient even then. It has remained familiar ever since. This is why Atlantis has been repeatedly moved into the concerns of later centuries. Renaissance writers connected it with newly encountered continents. 19th century theorists made it the ancestor of all civilizations. Modern storytellers filled it with advanced machines or secret knowledge. Environmental writers saw in it a warning about the misuse of nature. Each version rebuilt the city according to the needs of its own time. The stones changed, but the water remained, and still, beyond every interpretation, there is the simple fascination of a drowned place. To stand beside the sea at night is to understand that fascination without argument. The surface reflects the moon, yet reveals almost nothing below. A few meters from shore, familiar ground disappears into darkness. Farther out, the depth becomes unimaginable. Mountains stand beneath the water without casting a shadow upon the sky. It is easy to believe that the sea remembers more than we do. It does preserve ruins, wrecks, forests, and old coastlines. It also erases context, scatters objects, and carries stories away from the places where they began. The ocean is both archive and destroyer, preserving a timber in cold mud while dissolving the city around it. Atlantis belongs perfectly to this double nature. It survives because it is lost. Had archaeologists uncovered its streets, dated its walls, and translated its records, The city would become one ancient society among many. It would gain certainty and lose some of its boundlessness. Its mysteries would narrow into real questions about language, economy, belief, and daily life. But because it remains beyond proof, it can still contain every possibility. It can be a memory of Thera, a reflection of Athens, a fable of empire, a distorted flood tradition, or simply Plato's most enduring imagined shore. Below the waves, no answer rises. Only the slow currents move across the unseen ground, touching stone, shell, and sand, without distinguishing between what once existed and what humanity has merely dreamed. And yet humanity has never been entirely content with silence. Again and again, people return to the old dialogues and read them as though a door might open between the lines. They compare Plato's measurements with ancient units. They trace coastlines on maps. They study volcanic islands, drowned plains, and the shapes of river deltas. They ask whether a name was copied incorrectly, whether a number grew larger in transmission, or whether the pillars of Heracles once referred to a different passage of water. The hope behind these efforts is not foolish in itself. History has often surprised those who believed the map was complete. Cities dismissed as legend have sometimes been found, though rarely in the form later imagination expected. Ancient settlements have emerged beneath fields, deserts, and seas. Inscriptions have restored forgotten kings. Shipwrecks have revealed trade routes no surviving text described, but discovery is not the same as confirmation. When Heinrich Schliemann excavated at Helike in the 19th century, he uncovered a mound containing many layers of occupation. One of those cities may have belonged to the world that helped inspire traditions of Troy. Yet archaeology did not reveal Homer's poems turned to stone. It revealed a complex place, rebuilt many times, shaped by trade, war, fire, and ordinary life. The lesson is gentle but important. A story may preserve a distant echo without preserving every detail. It may gather several memories into one. It may magnify a local conflict into a war of heroes, or transform a damaged town into a vanished empire. Archaeology can bring us nearer to the conditions from which a story grew, but it rarely removes all uncertainty. If some memory lies behind Atlantis, it may never be isolated from Plato's design. Perhaps a report of Helike's destruction remained vivid in Athens. Perhaps accounts of Thera's broken island circulated in altered form. Perhaps traders returning from the western Mediterranean spoke of rich lands, wide rivers, and distant Atlantic shores. Perhaps Egyptian priests did tell Solon stories of ancient floods and forgotten peoples, though not necessarily of Atlantis as Plato describes it. Any of these fragments might have entered the philosopher's imagination. But fragments do not become evidence merely because they fit. A careful historian must resist the pleasure of completion. It is tempting to take one submerged town, one volcanic eruption, one ancient flood, and one Western trading culture, then join them into a single chain. The result feels satisfying because every loose piece appears to find its place. Yet the chain may exist only in the hands of the person assembling it. The ancient world was full of disasters and maritime powers. Earthquakes were common enough to inspire gods and myths. Flood stories arose wherever rivers and seas threatened settlement. Wealthy islands and coastal cities traded across long distances. Empires expanded and failed. None of these elements requires Atlantis, though all helped make Atlantis believable. Believability is one of the story's greatest achievements. Plato understood that a lesson becomes stronger when it is given a landscape. Abstract warnings about greed and imperial ambition can feel distant. A city of circular harbors, shining metals, warm springs, and mountain forests can be entered in the mind. Once entered, it's difficult to leave. You can almost feel the bridge beneath your feet as a merchant vessel passes below. You can hear bronze tools in the workshops and water moving through stone channels. You can smell fish drying near the harbour, resin on newly repaired hulls, and bread cooling in shaded courtyards. Above the roofs, the temple rises at the centre. Beyond the walls, the plain stretches toward the mountains. Farther still, the Atlantic glows beneath the setting sun. The city feels real because it contains weather, labour, distance, and routine. It is not only an emblem of pride, it is a place where people would wake before dawn, complain about taxes, worry about storms, and wait for ships carrying relatives home. This imagined ordinariness gives the final destruction its quiet sadness. The rulers may have become corrupt, but most inhabitants would have had little influence over imperial policy. A potter does not command a fleet. A child does not decide that another island must pay tribute. A farmer clearing an irrigation ditch does not shape the ambitions of kings. Yet in stories of divine judgment, entire cities often share the fate of their rulers. Ancient audiences were familiar with this pattern. Communities were understood as bound together through law, worship, ancestry, and obligation. The wrongdoing of leaders could endanger everyone. A broken oath might stain a whole people. Disaster could be interpreted not as private misfortune but as a collective reckoning. Modern listeners may feel the difficulty more sharply. They may ask about the innocent, the ordinary, and the unseen. They may wonder what became of the harbour workers, gardeners, servants, craftspeople, and families who had no place in the councils of power. Plato does not pause for them. His story moves at the scale of states. Atlantis grows proud, Athens resists, the gods judge, the sea closes. But when the tale is slowed, when we walk through the city before its ending, those unnamed lives begin to appear. An old woman tends herbs in a courtyard near the inner canal. A boy carries a basket of figs toward the market. A shipwright checks a seam with the edge of his thumb. Two sisters fold linen in a room where afternoon light falls across a painted wall. A fisherman repairs a net while listening to rumours of the fleet. None knows that later ages will remember only the city. Perhaps this is true of history more broadly. Great names survive while ordinary lives fade. Kings remain in lists, battles receive dates, temples keep the names of patrons. But the people who raised the stones, swept the floors, prepared the food, and watched the weather often vanish almost completely. Archaeology sometimes returns them to us. A worn step shows where feet pass daily. A child's footprint hardens in ancient mud. A spindle whorl rests beside a collapsed wall. A meal remains unfinished in a cooking pot. These are small recoveries, but they restore scale to the past. Atlantis has no such objects. Its people exist only in the spaces Plato left unfilled and the imagination gently enters. That may be another reason the city feels endless. Without artifacts to define them, its inhabitants can stand for all those lost communities whose names and stories did not survive. They are the villagers beneath rising seas, the sailors who never returned, the families who left an island under falling ash, the builders of harbours now covered by weeds and water, the keepers of memories that ended when the final speaker died. In this sense, Atlantis is larger than the search for one city. It has become a vessel for the human awareness that entire worlds can disappear while traces remain too faint to read. The sea at night makes this truth feel close. Waves fold over one another beneath the moon. Each crest appears, travels a little way, and dissolves into the next. No single wave endures, yet the ocean remains. So too with cities, kingdoms, and generations. They rise into view for a time, shaped by forces both chosen and inherited. They leave patterns upon the shore. Then other lives pass over them and memory becomes less certain. Somewhere in that uncertainty, Atlantis continues to wait, not below a particular latitude perhaps, but in the place where history becomes legend and legend begins to sound like memory. Memory, however, is not a place where anyone can remain forever. At last, even the most persistent search must return to the shore and consider what has truly been found. Not a continent beneath the Atlantic, not a temple of Poseidon shining below the waves, not the records of 10 kings or the wreckage of a fleet that once threatened the ancient Mediterranean. What has been found is a story. It begins in the conversations of Plato, shaped by the anxieties of a city that knew both power and defeat. It borrows the authority of Egypt, the mystery of the Western Ocean, the terror of earthquakes, and the old belief that pride may summon ruin. It gives these elements a landscape so carefully ordered that readers have searched for its circles ever since. The search has led in many directions. It has crossed the caldera of Santorini, where painted rooms sleep beneath volcanic ash. It has wandered through the marshes of southern Spain and over the green islands of the Atlantic. It has descended to drowned streets near Greece, followed vanished rivers beneath the North Sea, and examined natural stones that resemble walls only until they are studied more closely. In every place, Atlantis has asked the same question of those who seek it. Can wonder remain patient? Can curiosity accept that resemblance is not proof? Can a person admire the possibility of a lost world while allowing evidence to decide whether that world was truly there? The finest archaeology depends upon this kind of restraint. It does not begin by demanding a golden city, it begins with a fragment and asks where it belongs. A piece of pottery may lead to a forgotten trade route, a submerged hearth may reveal an old shoreline, a pollen grain may show that a landscape once held woodland where today there is open sea. Each small discovery widens the past without forcing it into legend. Perhaps this is the gift Atlantis has offered despite never being found. It has drawn generations toward questions of geology, navigation, ancient philosophy, maritime trade, and the fragility of settlements beside water. It has encouraged people to imagine the past not as a flat list of dates, but as a world of weather, labor, ambition, fear, and daily routine. The imagined island has become a doorway to real history. Through it, one may reach the harbours of Bronze Age Crete, where merchants loaded painted jars aboard timber vessels. One may walk the streets of Akrotiri before ash sealed its rooms. One may stand beside the vanished coast of Doggerland, where families watched herds move across plains now buried beneath cold water. These places do not need to be Atlantis. Their own names, or even their namelessness, are enough. And perhaps Plato's island becomes more beautiful when it is allowed to remain what the evidence most strongly suggests: a philosophical creation built from the materials of history, myth, and human experience. Its truth would then lie not in coordinates, but in recognition. Civilizations can become proud. Power can disguise itself as wisdom. Prosperity can make limits seem unnecessary. The structures people build may appear permanent, yet the ground beneath them continues to move. The sea continues to rise and fall, and memory depends upon fragile voices carrying stories from one generation to the next. Plato placed these truths within a city surrounded by rings of water. He allowed Atlantis to become splendid before allowing it to become lost. Its beauty was necessary because warnings are strongest when they concern something worth preserving. Had the island been poor, chaotic, and already ruined, its sinking would have meant little. But Atlantis was fertile, its harbours were busy, its artisans were skilled, its founders had laws, its people inherited abundance. The tragedy lay in the fact that they possessed enough and still desired more. Perhaps this is the final mystery of Atlantis, not whether its walls exist beneath the ocean, but why human beings so often fail to recognize sufficiency while they still possess it? The answer may be no easier to find than the city. For now, the sea keeps breathing beneath the night. Imagine the Atlantic from a quiet cliff beyond the lights of any town. The horizon is almost invisible. The sky descends until stars seem to touch the water. Far below, currents pass over volcanic ridges, old sediment, living reefs, and wrecks that have not seen daylight for centuries. No single shape below bears the name Atlantis, yet the ocean contains countless lost mornings. There are places where people once opened doors onto streets that no longer exist. Places where children followed paths now crossed by fish. Places where fires burned on ground covered today by many meters of water. Their names may be gone, but their reality remains. That truth is quieter than Plato's empire and perhaps more moving. The sea did not swallow one perfect civilization and leave the rest of history untouched. It has taken shorelines slowly, settlements suddenly, ships without warning, and memories almost imperceptibly. It has always stood beside human life as road, provider, boundary, and risk. Ancient sailors understood this even when they did not understand the forces beneath it. They poured offerings before voyages. They watched the clouds. They listened to the hull. They respected headlands where currents met and straits where winds turned against one another. For them, the sea was never empty. It was full of intention, danger, livelihood, and story. Atlantis belongs to that maritime imagination. It waits just beyond the known passage, where the familiar sea opens into a larger darkness. It is distant enough to escape verification and near enough to tempt the voyage. It shines most brightly at the very edge of the map. But dawn eventually reaches every edge. The stars fade, the horizon returns as a thin silver line. Waves become visible one by one, and seabirds begin to move above them. The imagined towers beneath the water dissolve into ordinary blue. On the shore, stones remain wet from the night tide. A person walking there might find a shell, a piece of worn glass, or a fragment of pottery carried from some forgotten place. The object would not prove Atlantis. It would offer something gentler, evidence that the sea is always moving the past, breaking it, preserving it, and returning small pieces when it chooses. And so the lost city may be left where it has endured longest. Not beneath one island, desert, or continental shelf, but within the deep meeting place of history and imagination. There, its canals still reflect the evening sky. Its ships move quietly through the rings. Its gardens receive water from warm and cold springs. Its people close their shutters and prepare for sleep, unaware that philosophers, explorers, archaeologists, and dreamers will one day search for them across the world. Now the lamps of Atlantis grow faint. The bridges disappear into mist. The temple becomes only a pale shape at the center of the water. Beyond the outer harbor, the sea stretches toward darkness, calm and measureless beneath the stars. And Midnight Cat, having followed the old legend to its farthest shore, turns softly homeward. Rest now, dear listener, let the questions drift away with the tide. The city does not need to be found tonight. It is enough to have walked its imagined streets, listened to the ancient sea, and remembered the countless real worlds resting quietly beneath the waves.